guys, it's me, Em again, and welcome back to my channel where we talk about all things sinister. If you are interested in true crime or if you like all things horror related, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. That way you can join me for some morbid conversation. Now, like I said, the last episode, today we are going to be doing another episode of 5 pictures with the creepy or disturbing backstories. I really enjoy doing those. It gives me a bit of a break, especially after doing like the last story we did was a 3-part episode. Those take a lot of work, and these tend to be a little bit quicker and easier for me to do. However, I do put a lot of effort into these because I am constantly looking for pictures that are not completely regurgitated. It seems like we always see the same pictures come up in these kind of videos, and I'm constantly trying to find newer, fresher content that's not as prevalent. So I hope that I have some pictures and some stories that you have not seen before or you've not heard of before. As always, my email is going to be listed in the description box down below. If there are any pictures, any stories, anything that fits this realm of content, and you are wanting to send it to me in an email, it might be featured in one of these stories in the future. So with that being said, let's get to today's first picture on our list. It's New Year's Eve, 1981, and Patricia Gifford is ringing in the new year with her friend Delta Harville at a cocktail bar in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. While the two girls were sitting at the bar, they would be approached by 2 brothers. Gary Sucker, one of the brothers, had driven from Michigan to Florida to spend time visiting with his other brother, Dennis Sucker. The 2 brothers stayed at the bar flirting with the girls for some time, and this picture was taken during that time period of Patricia with Dennis in the background. Over the course of the evening, Delta ended up feeling ill from drinking too much, and she was helped to her car by her friend and the 2 brothers. Obviously too drunk to drive, Delta was going to sleep in the car for a bit until she felt better. The 2 brothers asked Patricia if she would like to go with them to get something to eat while her friend sobered up, and Patricia agreed. The 3 of them ended up going off together. According to a confession given by Dennis and corroborating testimony from Gary, Dennis would end up asking Patricia for sex and she would tell him no. He would end up getting her out of the truck and onto the ground. Gary would attempt to stop his brother by yelling at him and telling him to leave her alone, but would retreat back to the truck in fear when Dennis told him to. According to Dennis, he strangled Patricia on the side of the road. However, her body has never been found. Sucker would end up being found guilty of first-degree murder as well as kidnapping during the commission of a felony, and he would be sentenced to 22 years for the kidnapping, but would be sentenced to death for the murder. Now, this picture would not only be shown at his trial, but this is one of the pictures that would be shown on the news when they were looking for information regarding Patricia when she was just known to be missing. And seeing this picture on the news actually is what caused Sucker to flee town. And he ended up being arrested in Georgia after fleeing Florida. This next picture is a picture of a spire from the St. Lambert Church in Munster, Germany. And you can see in this picture a picture of 3 separate cages that are hanging from this spire. The cages were first hung on January 22nd, 1536, and they remain there to this day. Their original purpose was to hold the mutilated and tortured bodies of Jan Bockelstein and 2 other leaders of an opposing sect of religion known as the Anabaptist sect. In the 16th century, Munster was ruled by a Catholic named Franz von Waldeck. Despite being Catholic, he was accepting of several sects of religion so long as their basis was in Christianity. This led to Jan Bockelstein coming to Munster so that he could be free to practice his religion without the fear of prosecution. Once there, Bockelstein would end up building a base of support for his religion within Munster, particularly with the peasants, because he would talk about men being created equal and wealth being fairly distributed. This would result in the peasant uprisings of those who now followed the Anabaptist sect, and Jan Bokkelson would claim himself to be the new leader of the kingdom. Bokkelson and his allies would have control of the city for an entire year before it would be retaken by Franz von Waldeck. Once the city was taken back from the Anabaptists, Jan, alongside two of his major supporters, would be tortured and executed in the town square. Afterwards, their bodies would be hung within the cages for all to see. They would leave the bodies in these cages for 50 years before they would end up being removed. And after the bodies were removed, the cages still remained. This is a picture of 12-year-old Curtis Jones and his sister, 13-year-old Catherine Jones. And this picture is taken inside of a courtroom with the two siblings standing before a judge. Now, if you knew their history, you would likely think that they were standing in this courtroom as a result of a child abuse case. While this picture takes place in 1999, the years leading up to this day are riddled with allegations and instances of child abuse. In 1994, Curtis had complained that a family relative had begun to fondle him while staying in their home, which opened an investigation that would later be closed because Curtis would claim that he was lying about the accusation. 2 years later, caseworkers would once again open a case with Curtis Jones, this time in response to an injury to his eye, which was black and blue and swollen. 2 years after this investigation, another investigation would be opened at the Jones home, this time because Catherine Jones had a teacher who suspected that she was being sexually abused. When child welfare looked into it, they even found some indicators that would point toward confirmation of this abuse. However, according to Kathleen, her father would intimidate her and her brother to lie to any authority about any potential abuse that was happening in the home, which they did. Unbelievably, child welfare would close the case on this investigation as well. Upon closing the investigation, they would also inform Catherine and Curtis's father that the relative that had been living with them was a convicted pedophile and probably shouldn't be living there. So the man that Catherine and Curtis had been complaining about abusing them was a convicted pedophile. Catherine showed indicators of being abused, and there was a history of investigations into the household, and still the case was closed. Finally, being tired of the abuse and no one taking up for them, Curtis and Catherine had planned together on killing their abuser as well as their father and his girlfriend for allowing the abuse to continue. On January 6, 1999, the brother and the sister would shoot their father's girlfriend 4 times with their father's gun before fleeing the home. They were arrested the following day, with her being the only casualty in the case. Curtis and Catherine would each end up being sentenced to 18 years in prison, and they would serve 16 years apiece. At the time, Curtis was the youngest convicted murderer in the United States at only 12 years old. These two kids would spend their entire teenage years and young adult life in prison because of a system that failed them. Curtis would be almost 30 years old before he would end up getting out, and Catherine, a little bit older. This is a still from a live news broadcast that was aired on March 16, 1984. The news station was covering the story of a pedophile who had fled from Louisiana to California with an 11-year-old boy, and he was being brought home from California to Louisiana to be charged. Jeff Doucette was a karate instructor, and he had Jody Planche as one of his students. At first, it seemed like the two were close just because of their student-teacher relationship, but little did the adults in Jody's life know the young boy was slowly having his boundaries tested and pushed by his instructor. Jeff eventually concocted a plan to take Jody to California and did this by lying to Jody's mom so that she would allow the boy to leave with him. Once he had Jody, he shaved his beard and dyed Jody's hair to conceal their identities. He then took the boy on a bus to California, where he would escalate the abuse to the boy once they arrived. Jody's parents, Gary and June, immediately went to the police when Jody didn't come back home, and they began a search for the boy. It would be 10 days before they were able to make progress toward finding Jody. Jeff would allow Jody to call his parents, and in doing so, police were able to trace that call to where the kidnapper was keeping the boy in California. This would obviously lead to them bringing Jody back home, as well as bringing Jeff Doucette back to Louisiana to be charged and stand trial. Over this time period, it began to leak that Doucette had abused and assaulted Jody, something that would end up being confirmed via an abuse kit that they performed on Jody once they had him in custody. When Gary Planche heard that Doucette would be arriving at the airport, he made plans to be there waiting for him. In fact, that's Gary in the back of this picture, standing by the payphone. News stations would be broadcasting live coverage of Jeff Doucette arriving back in Louisiana to face the crimes that he had committed, and in doing so, they would also broadcast Gary Planche pulling out a concealed gun and shooting Doucette in the head, fatally wounding him. Doucette would end up succumbing to his injuries the following day, and Gary would go before a judge where he would be sentenced to a 7 years of suspended sentence, 5 years of probation, and 300 hours of community service. On March 6, 1995, Scott Amador and Jonathan Schmitz would both be featured on The Jenny Jones Show. And on this episode, Scott would admit to being a secret admirer of Jonathan's. Schmitz knew before going on the show that he was going to be confronted by a secret admirer, but he claimed that he was under the assumption that the admirer would be a female. When he found out that the admirer was another man, he was caught off guard. 3 days following the taping of this episode, Amador would leave a flirtatious note on Schmitz's vehicle. Schmitz would respond to this note that wasn't signed by buying a shotgun and going to Amador's home and asking him if he was the one who left the note. When Amador implied with a smile that he did, Schmitz would retrieve the shotgun from his car and shoot Scott twice in the chest, killing him. Schmitz would immediately leave the home and call 911, confessing to the murder. His defense in court when he was on trial was mental illness and being humiliated on TV. Schmitz's lawyers would use what was known as gay panic or homosexual panic in defense, which is when someone responds to unwanted sexual advances by a member of the same sex in a violent way because they were so offended or so frightened that it provoked them to react in a self-defense kind of way, which I think we can all agree is bullshit. He would end up being found guilty of second-degree murder the following year and sentenced to 25 to 50 years before having the conviction overturned. He would be retried and found guilty again during the second trial, which would reinstate his original sentence. He would end up being paroled in 2017. So the family of Scott Amador ended up suing the Jenny Jones Show as well as Telepictures and Warner Brothers. And they did this because they said that Jonathan Schmitz had been blindsided when he was brought onto the show. And it was their negligence that ultimately led to Scott's death. And a jury agreed with them. And their family, his family, ended up being awarded over $29 million in their lawsuit. All right, friends, that is going to be it for today's episode of the 5 pictures with the disturbing or sinister backstories. I hope there is at least one or two that maybe you haven't seen before, or one or two stories that you haven't heard of before. Like I said at the start of the video, if you have any suggestions on any pictures that you want me to look at or maybe feature in a video like this, my email is always going to be listed down in the description box down below. Same thing with all my other social medias, my TikTok, my, you know, Instagram, Twitter, all that is going to be listed down in the description box down below. You can contact me on any of those. Make sure, if you aren't already, that you are subscribed to the channel. I put out new content as often as I'm able to. It usually ends up being a couple times a week, some weeks. But I at least try to shoot for at least once a week when I can. I am a mom of 2, so sometimes it's a little hard. But since I'm not really consistent quite yet, make sure you have your post notification bell turned on. Having that turned on will notify you the next time that I post another chat. And that way you'll be notified so you can join me for my next morbid conversation. Until then, though, my friends, take care, stay safe, and I'll talk to you later, okay? All right. Bye.